Welcome, Holly. I can't see you, but welcome, and we look forward to hearing from you. And then our second speaker is Will Burns, and I've known Will for a very long time, and I will say that when I was first starting to work in the field, I work in international environmental law and environmental law. His work was some of the first that really engaged me and was really, really influential, and so it's always a pleasure to have him here. He's always working kind of at the cutting edge of issues in international environmental law. Will has his PhD from Wales, in international law from the University of Wales, Cardiff School of Law. He's been a scholar in residence at the School of International Service at American University. He's also a senior fellow in International Law Research Program at the Center for International Governance Innovation. He founded the MSc in Energy Policy and Climate Program at Johns Hopkins. He's worked at schools kind of across the USA. He's written very broadly in the field of international environmental law, everything from whaling and cetaceans to geoengineering, and of relevance to us today, he has a recent book, a terrific volume called Climate Change, Geoengineering, Philosophical Perspectives, Legal Issues, and Governance Frameworks. So we have a kind of a terrific perspective that will be represented between Holly and Will, and I don't want to waste any more of their time, so what we'll do is we'll let them each speak for like 20-ish minutes, and then I'll try to start the conversation by engaging the two of them with some questions, and then we'll leave plenty of time for audience questions, which I will let you describe.
So while I'm pulling the slides up, I just want to call your attention to the address at the bottom of your program, go.osu.edu/ask. You can ask questions all throughout the talk. We'll be pulling from the ones that get upvoted for sentiment to be asking towards the end. So if something interesting comes up, you want clarification, you can do that immediately or you can wait until the end. I also encourage you to skim over the questions that are already being asked just to see if any of them are interesting, even if you don't have a question of your own. So, okay, at this point, let's bring Will up. Hold on.
It's just what we talked about.
I know, right? Love this thing.
There we go. Oops, almost.
Nothing happened, right? It has? Oh.
There you go. You're good.
If the button doesn't change color. Thank you for letting me. Go ahead.
All right. All right. Thanks, everyone, for coming. I'm a native Illinoisan, so it's always nice to be back in the heartland. So appreciate you coming today. So in November of 2016, the Paris Climate Agreement entered into force. And this is an international treaty that it was contemplated would govern climate change at the international level in the medium term and in the long term. And it is a treaty that has been embraced by virtually every country in the world, at least all civilized countries other than the United States, which is now withdrawing from it. Despite that fact, because the rest of the world has committed itself to this agreement as its primary vehicle for addressing climate change, I think it's pertinent to ask the question whether one form of climate geoengineering, which we call carbon dioxide removal approaches, and we'll talk a little bit more of what those are, would have a role in the Paris Agreement. And in looking at that, I want to ask two questions. First of all, could the parties, the people that have joined the Paris Agreement, effectuate their obligations under the treaty by embracing carbon dioxide removal options and deploying them? And the second question is does the Paris Agreement have other provisions that would regulate these options in terms of which options could be deployed and at what scale? And so I'm going to look at both of those questions. Okay. So the first question is does the Paris Agreement authorize the parties to the treaty to use carbon dioxide removal approaches as one of their ways of reducing their emissions or mitigating their greenhouse gas emissions? Okay. So one thing to start with that's important is to look at the actual objectives of the Paris Agreement. Right. So Paris seeks to hold temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and it has an aspirational goal, at least, of holding those temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius below pre-industrial levels. To effectuate this goal, Paris includes mitigation commitments by all of the parties to one degree or another. Developed countries are supposed to commit to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions on an absolute basis. Developing countries are supposed to, over time, move toward meeting that goal. Okay, and at the heart of this mandate of Paris are the parties' mitigation pledges, what they agree to do in terms of reducing their emissions, and we call those NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. And you can see this in Article 4. Each party is to prepare an NDC that it intends to achieve, and it's to pursue, quote unquote, domestic mitigation measures with the aim of achieving the objectives of those contributions, which is to reduce their emissions and meet the temperature target that we talked about earlier. Now, the Paris Agreement doesn't explicitly define the term mitigation. However, it's part of a parent agreement, which is called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the Framework Convention does define the term mitigation, right? And it says in Article 4 that mitigation can be done by limiting your emissions of greenhouse gases or protecting and enhancing greenhouse gas sinks and reservoirs, right? So the next question is what does given the fact that carbon dioxide removal approaches would not reduce emissions, would carbon dioxide removal approaches constitute a sink or a reservoir that would be enhanced if you were to deploy it? So you have to define the term sinks and reservoirs. So if you look at the Framework Convention again, in Article 1, it defines the term sink as processes which remove a greenhouse gas, an aerosol, or a precursor of a greenhouse gas from the atmosphere. Okay, and if you look at Article 4, it provides some specific examples of what constitutes sinks, including biomass and forests and oceans and terrestrial, coastal, and marine ecosystems. So if you look at this definition, and then you look at what we traditionally define as carbon dioxide removal options, it would appear that they would be a means of enhancing sinks, and thus would fall under the treaty and could be one of the means of mitigating one's greenhouse gas emissions. Bioenergy and carbon capture and sequestration, for example, seeks to use bioenergy feedstocks such as trees or dedicated crops or waste to produce energy, and then we capture that carbon dioxide, we compress it, we then ship it and store it either terrestrially or in the world's oceans. Similarly, ocean iron fertilization seeks to increase the amount of phytoplankton in the world's oceans to take up carbon dioxide that's then sequestered when they die. Some of these others, such as direct air capture, seeks to take in ambient air, separate out the carbon dioxide, and store it. So these would all appear to be means of enhancing sinks. Furthermore, if we look back at the Paris Agreement itself, we see that there are several provisions in Paris that seem to also privilege anything that does that. Article 5 talks about taking actions to conserve and enhance sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases. So again, to the extent that carbon dioxide removal options would do that, it would be one of the ways that the parties could mitigate and thus meet their objectives under Paris. And Article 4 also has a goal of past 2050 of achieving a balance between emissions and sinks. And so anything that could enhance sinks would appear to be a way to do that. Now, one wrinkle in this is that some legal scholars argue that if you look at the Framework Convention's definition of sinks, it talks about enhancing sinks, right? Which they argue implies that the sinks already exist and they're simply being strengthened. If that were true, some of the carbon dioxide removal options we're talking about would clearly fall under this rubric. Ocean iron fertilization would enhance a sink, phytoplankton, that already existed by simply trying to increase their propagation. Similarly, if you look at enhanced mineral weathering, spreading silicate materials to try to take up more carbon dioxide, it would be part of a natural process that already exists to do that. But bioenergy and carbon capture, as well as direct air capture, would require us to capture carbon dioxide and store it in areas where it wasn't being stored now. Arguably, that's not enhancing an existing sink, but creating new sinks. On the other hand, under the Kyoto Protocol, an agreement that was established under the Framework Convention, eventually the parties agreed that carbon capture and sequestration, which is another way of capturing carbon and would be part of some of these other processes, could receive credits under the protocol. And so it is seen that that distinction in terms of enhancing sinks is not one that might be adhered to under Paris. So probably all of these technologies ultimately could be one of the forms of mitigating emissions in the future under the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement also has other provisions that might be helpful to incentivizing these technologies in the future. Article 6 talks about voluntary agreements between countries where countries might pay for other countries, for example, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and the other countries would take credit for that. It may be possible that in the cases of bioenergy, for example, and carbon capture and sequestration, that a lot of the prime bioenergy sources may be in the South, for example, meaning the world South. And it may be that developed countries could help pay for the development of those projects and the storage of the resultant carbon dioxide and receive credit. And so this mechanism would be one that could provide for that. Similarly, Article 10 talks about transferring technology to other countries, and this again would be a way to effectuate these goals. Now, the second question is beyond whether the countries do claim carbon dioxide removal as one of the ways that they're going to meet their pledges, are there other provisions of Paris that might regulate what technologies would be deployed and at what scale and what kind of safeguards would have to be put in place? Because one of the things that I want to emphasize is that carbon dioxide removal approaches, many of the carbon dioxide removal approaches, while they could provide some great benefits in terms of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, they could propose and impose some substantial risks on a socioeconomic and environmental scale. And I want to look at what Paris might say about that. Okay, so if you look at the preamble or the introductory language to Paris, one of the things that it says is that it recognizes, quote, that parties may be affected not only by climate change, but also by the impacts of measures taken in response to it, okay? So it acknowledges that not only do we have to be looking at the impacts of climate change itself, but we have to be careful in terms of looking at the impacts that how we respond to climate change may play themselves out, right? And we see that in the preamble as well as Article 4. Moreover, if you look at the introductory language to the treaty, it provides for the protection of specific interests that might be pertinent in deciding how we might deploy carbon dioxide removal options in the future. First of all, if you look at the preambular language here, it says that when the countries take action to address climate change, they have to, quote unquote, respect, promote, and consider their obligations in terms of human rights. Okay, so keep that in mind. Any kind of response to climate change is also supposed to respect and protect the human rights of the people in the world. Second of all, under Paris, the preamble also talks about the importance of protecting the integrity of all ecosystems, including oceans and biodiversity. Okay, and then finally, there's a number of specific places where it indicates that that when we take measures to respond to climate change, we have to ensure equitable access to sustainable development and protection of sustainable development. okay? So how might those play out in the deployment of some of these technologies? And I would suggest they all might be pertinent. Let's start off with bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, right? So this is the idea that we burn bioenergy feedstocks, we use it for fuels in cars, we use it for heat, electricity, we then capture the carbon dioxide that's in the flue gases that are produced, and we store it, okay? And then we grow more bioenergy to capture more carbon. This technology is one that we call a negative emissions technology because in theory it can result in a net reduction in atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide. Sounds good, okay? At the same time, it could have some serious risks at very large scale. For example, a number of recent studies have indicated that if you're going to grow all of the feedstock to utilize this system, okay, you're going to need a lot of land, okay? A lot of this is going to come from dedicated crops, switchgrasses, things of this nature. One recent study indicated that it might require 7 to 25% of all the net primary productivity on Earth. Okay? Or, to put it in another perspective, perhaps 20 to 25% of arable land on Earth. Okay? If one were to do this at a large scale, for example, try to sequester somewhere between 10 or 15 gigatons of carbon dioxide a year, billion tons, and that's what a lot of the studies say we may need to hold temperatures to below 2 degrees Celsius, that could have huge impacts in terms of food security. One recent study indicated that large-scale deployment of BECCS could result in food prices for the world's most vulnerable people rising somewhere between 25 and 35% annually, right? And this could result in a large reduction in calories for many. It could result in starvation for many. And we've seen some of this already in terms of biofuel mandates that were put in place in the European Union on a much smaller scale, but with very large attendant increases in food prices because areas that were growing food for people were now being diverted to produce fuel for biofuels. This kind of impact could have serious implications for a well-recognized international human right to food, for example. And to the extent that the Paris Agreement indicates that we're to protect international human rights, I would suggest that the Paris Agreement would have the authority and the moral obligation to try to assess the human obligations of scaling up bioenergy to the point where this kind of impact could happen. Similarly, if we look at bioenergy and carbon capture, we also know that it would require huge amounts of water. One recent study said that if you were to seek to sequester 10 to 15 gigatons of carbon dioxide a year, you would need as much water as all of the irrigable water that we use on Earth currently. Right? So you're going to have to double the amount of water at a time when populations are increasing and water is declining. This could have implications for the human right to water that's recognized under a number of international human rights instruments. At the same time, bioenergy and carbon capture could have huge biodiversity impacts, especially if we were to divert large amounts of land where we had trees and other kinds of sensitive ecosystems. One recent study said that large-scale deployment of BECCS could produce as much negative impact on biodiversity as raising temperatures by between 2.8 and 2.9 degrees Celsius, right? And that could have implications in terms of the human right to health, as well as the human right to subsistence, given the impacts of biodiversity in those contexts. Similarly, if you look at BECCS, it could have obviously ecosystem impacts, and the Paris Agreement indicates we're to protect those, and it could have impacts in terms of sustainable development, right? The Sustainable Development Goals that were established in 2015 as a framework to effectuate the goals of sustainable development talk about the right to water, for example, and the right to food, and those could similarly be impacted in terms of large-scale use of this technology. Okay. One other example, because we're short for time, is ocean iron fertilization. This is another one of the carbon dioxide removal approaches that we're talking about. Ocean iron fertilization would involve fertilizing the world's oceans with a micronutrient, that being iron, or macronutrients such as phosphorus or nitrogen, to try to stimulate production of phytoplankton. The phytoplankton would take in the inorganic carbon, convert it to organic organic carbon, use it for photosynthesis, and then a small percentage of that CO2 would drop to the bottom of the ocean with the species when they died. Okay, that's the idea behind ocean iron fertilization. Ocean iron fertilization in some studies could have a dramatic impact in terms of sequestering carbon dioxide, perhaps sequestering as much as 15 or 20% of all of the CO2 that's in the atmosphere. On the other hand, it could have huge negative ecosystem impacts. It could produce a proliferation of species that were unpalatable to zooplankton species in that ecosystem, right? And that could result in a trophic cascade, with the loss of zooplankton species resulting in consequent loss of higher order species, right? To the extent that you have that risk, you again implicate potential human rights of subsistence, as well as food, as well as the need to protect ecosystems under the Paris Agreement, including most specifically the oceans, and this would have to be assessed. Similarly, some studies have indicated that it would rob downstream areas of nutrients that could result in substantial declines in fisheries, which again would have implications in terms of the human right to food as well as subsistence. Okay, so I would argue that one of the obligations under the Paris Agreement would be to ensure that if we deploy these technologies, we would seek to deploy them as a portfolio of responses, each at a scale that does not pass critical thresholds in terms of creating these kind of harms. And Paris at least would provide some means to compel countries that might consider these technologies to take these considerations in mind in a way that they might not otherwise. Okay, so the last question I'd ask is there a mechanism in Paris that would facilitate this kind of assessment? And I think the good news is there is, okay? If you look at this decision, this was a decision that was taken at the Framework Convention on Climate Change, that's the parent agreement to Paris. In 2011, they established what's called a forum and work program on the impact of the implementation of response measures, okay? And what this forum is supposed to do is to assess what will happen in terms of different ways of responding to climate change and what the implications are. Okay? Now, one of the things I need to emphasize here is that this forum was not created for this purpose. It was primarily driven by OPEC's desire to ensure that you look at the economic impact on them if you reduce the use of fossil fuels by trying to address climate change, right? So quite a different purpose, okay? But if you look at the language, on the other hand here, it would facilitate also looking at negative impacts of responses such as carbon dioxide removal. And I would argue that it's something that we should be looking at. Moreover, the forum itself was ultimately adopted and referenced in the Paris Agreement, and one of the ways that it was strengthened in the Paris Agreement was it authorized the establishment of ad hoc committees to study specific response measures. And so one of the things that I would argue is that as we start to research these technologies more in earnest and we start to potentially deploy these technologies, Paris should establish an ad hoc committee to seek to assess these technologies in ways that effectuates the goals of maximizing their benefits from a climate perspective, but also minimizing the potential impacts in terms of human rights, in terms of ecosystem impacts, and in terms of potentially undermining sustainable development. Okay? And I'm going to stop there, and the last thing that I'll say is that there is an important role, in my mind, for the law in this context, right? The science associated with these technologies is in its infancy, but the law has to keep up with it. Because one of the things that we want to try to do, at least, I think, is to ensure that we don't put ourselves in the same situation as we have with climate change itself, where some people have benefited disproportionately from burgeoning greenhouse gases and others have suffered horribly. It should be our objective to ensure that our responses take us down a different path, and I would suggest that Paris has means to ensure that that would happen. Thank you very much.
All right, Holly, you're on.
All right. Well, thank you all for bearing with this remote presentation. I'm going to start out by spending a few minutes on reviewing the situation that we're in, just in case there are people who weren't here in the morning, because the context, the climate change context, is foundational for everything else I'm going to say. And so we're in a situation where to keep warming at safe levels, we need to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Even managing limiting warming to 1.5 degrees is going to lock in significant impacts. Some people might not mind seeing Washington, D.C. underwater, but in some hundreds of years, that will eventually happen under both these scenarios. And this is indicated in the IPCC report that came out a few weeks ago. And there's been increasing media coverage on this over the past year, 2 years. Interestingly, in this IPCC report, the special report on 1.5 degrees, carbon removal is viewed as both a form of mitigation and as a way to come back down after an overshoot of emissions targets. And so the scale of carbon removal is a real social challenge. Consider the carbon budget. Each square here represents 1 billion tons of CO2. As was probably mentioned, we're burning through 40 or 50 billion tons per year. So in 10 years, we're more than a third towards exhausting the budget. And by 2040, it would be out. Plus, we don't really know how big this budget is. It tends to change based upon the latest science and new information. So this tight budget is why people talk about overshooting temperature targets. You've probably seen some version of this graph earlier in the day where negative emissions start to be deployed very quickly. By around 2070, you get to a 0 point and then negative at the level of about 10 billion tons of removal per year by 2100. And so, as was mentioned, there's two kind of big ideas about how to do this on an industrial scale, one being direct air capture. We pretty much know how to do this at a pilot scale, but there's a very large energy cost at present. Some colleagues at Climate Interactive have calculated that getting that 10 gigatons per year of removals would require 1.5 times the wind and solar capacity that we'd have in a low carbon scenario, or 1,200 nuclear power plants. So that's something that's going to have to be thought through more. I'm glad there's a lot of engineers in the room today who may be the ones thinking about this in the future. As Will mentioned, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is the other big idea. And this is what is already in the models as kind of a stand-in for carbon removal technology. As Will also mentioned, the land demands are massive. So the thing that underpins both of these technologies is geological carbon capture and storage. And you'd roughly need about 1,000 of the current scale facilities per gigaton of CO2. So if you're going to drive down 10 gigatons of CO2 by 2100, you know, you can do the math, it's going to be huge. And so there's been a little bit of thought about what kind of infrastructure would be required. For scale, there's maybe about 22 operating carbon capture and facilities around the world now, a handful of more on the drawing board, but a very long way from building out this kind of infrastructure. It would basically be on the scale of the existing fossil fuel industry. And so there's other ways to do this: afforestation and reforestation, natural climate solutions. Will already talked about some of these methods, so I won't go into them in detail. A key point to keep in mind is that some of these removals can only be done once. So lots of times people ask, can't we just accomplish this with natural climate solutions? Let nature do the work without having to build out this huge industrial infrastructure. So one challenge is that these things like soil carbon sequestration and afforestation, they're great to do right now because we know how to do them. They can have biodiversity and farmer benefits if done right. But they can't continue removing carbon indefinitely because the carbon sinks become saturated after a few decades, and then you have to keep doing the work of holding the carbon there. And so if you bet on afforestation to remove this carbon, and then there's a wildfire, you've just lost all the carbon you were trying to sequester. So the other key point here is that the rollout would have to be very quick. We'd have to start this right now. There's really no time for delay. And every year of delay on stopping emissions counts. So right now, there's this portfolio approach, like Will was talking about, where we're imagined to use a kind of every technology in the book. And so right now there's kind of a consensus or a coalition between people interested in natural climate solutions and people working on engineered approaches. The thing is that if you spend, this massive effort trying to plant these forests and convince all these farmers to store carbon in soils, that just buys us 5 more years of emissions at our current rate. And then we've kind of used up all that energy to hold the carbon there. So really, like, every year is a big deal, as you all probably know. So this is kind of where the discussion of solar geoengineering might come in. Can we use stratospheric particles to buy time for carbon removal? Doug, who spoke this morning, and others have thought about this, how you would kind of coordinate this kind of intervention to shave the peak off of this warming. And so one key point that often gets missed, which I think is a legacy of how this concept of geoengineering as an umbrella term emerged, it was kind of divided into these carbon removal solutions and solar geoengineering solutions. And then you would kind of take your pick between the best one as kind of a choice framework. But the real thing is that solar geoengineering implies carbon removal if you ever want to end that intervention. And then carbon removal implies massive rollout of renewables, in part because of the energy demands of some of these technologies. They would have to be done using renewable energy sources. So this is all kind of a package. You could definitely just do the renewables. I mean, well, that's a matter of contention right now. You could certainly do renewables and carbon removal, but if you're going to do solar geoengineering, you need those other two to make it all work. And so there's this discussion that's come up, well, is climate change reversible? Clearly some impacts might be reversible, some aren't, and it gets less reversible the longer we wait. So my area of expertise is more about studying how ordinary citizens engage with these concepts. How do you make sense of this idea that maybe parts of climate change are reversible, or that we could restore the climate? These are some of the languages that have been coming out lately. And so I'm going to spend kind of the rest of my time talking about this question. How do people understand reversing climate change? When it comes to carbon removal, I've seen basically 4 emergent discourses. One is around negative emissions. This is kind of derived from modeling efforts. And then there's a frame or a way of understanding about building out a new carbon economy and utilizing this carbon. There's also talk about drawdown, and related to that is an idea of regeneration, which is, I would say, a bit broader even. And so starting with negative emissions, this is an excerpt from one of Shell's reports. The way they see it is that inevitably some level of emissions from certain sectors and regions will remain, and that kind of negative emissions are used to mop up those residual emissions. So take that there. And then on the other hand, you have this best-selling book, Drawdown, you might be familiar with, where they critique this language of negative emissions. You know, they say this term has no meaning in any language. Imagine a negative house or a negative tree. The absence of something is nothing. They suggest the language about sequestration, about drawing down, which they call carbon positive. I'll return to that in a bit. Regeneration is this idea that it's kind of counterposed with sustainability. So sustainability is kind of maintaining the status quo, but not really going far enough. And regeneration is actually renewing soils, renewing communities. There's a few organizations, this one's local to LA where I live, but this is becoming a fairly significant movement. I might go out on a limb and say that. There's different companies that are getting behind regenerative agriculture standards. You can buy, this beer grown with a plant that sequesters carbon in its long roots. So there's some interest here at the intersection of agribusiness, even fashion materials. Then there's people looking at, this is from Regen Network, different technologies that would be used to kind of monitor and verify the carbon sequestration. So another narrative that has come up a lot too is this idea that can't we just use the carbon for things? You can make shoes out of it, you can transform it into valuable products. There's an idea that there's a $1 trillion economy here. The obvious problem here, as the engineers and others will know, is that you could only really use maybe 1% of the carbon we're emitting productively. So I don't personally see this as a major solution to the scale of the emissions we have. But proponents argue that this is a really great way to get people on board with thinking about carbon in a different way. And so the main thing, I've been researching this through a few methods. One was a survey experiment, is that people really don't know a lot about carbon removal. So that's probably obvious, but worth stating. And then solar geoengineering, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the research that's been done on this over the past 10 years. And I'll just start out by saying, my reading of this research is that after a decade of social science research on geoengineering with a handful of studies, I don't think we actually have much actionable knowledge for decision makers. There's been a handful of surveys, more looking at public perception things, and then there's been deliberative small N studies like focus groups that have kind of a different rationale in terms of engaging people and getting their feedback in a more substantive way. So these studies can kind of fall on a continuum between measuring public opinion, soliciting public opinion, and then really deliberating these technologies. And so these are some of the questions people have asked. How widespread is public knowledge of solar geoengineering? What factors are driving those perceptions of it? Is there a moral hazard? By that I mean, does solar geoengineering interfere with willingness to mitigate? Does it galvanize support for existing climate policies? How does the emergency framing or other framings of naturalness affect views of geoengineering? And what they found, there's a remarkably similar set of concerns across the global north about ecological and social controllability. There's nuanced views with very reluctant and conditional acceptance. So it really depends what context these technologies are when you start discussing them with people. They're not just disembodied techniques or technologies in the way that your iPhone is a technology. The social context is really important for people. But in general, and most of these studies have been done in the global north. I don't really think we know what people think, and I think that what people think is going to change based on the context. So I thought I'd point to a couple of things that sometimes get missed in deliberations of these technologies. That with solar geoengineering, the particles go all around the globe, more or less. After 1 to 2 years, they rain out. A lot of the discussion is about global mean temperature, but there's also a lot of things that are important, like ocean acidification, ocean impacts. And it's not just whether, which technology or how that's contested. I already talked about most of these things related to CDR, but my constant struggle is to get some of these fairly basic things into the discussion. From a social standpoint, one major challenge is that there's already a conspiracy that's effectively absorbed discussion of this topic. So a couple of researchers at Harvard tried studying the prevalence of this idea about chemtrails, that the sky is being sprayed. And they found that 10% of Americans declared this as completely true. And then a large margin thought it might be somewhat true, interestingly, with no apparent difference by party affiliation. And so if you look at some of the popular content that's circulating on the internet, if you search for these things, you'll find some of these stories about chemtrails, weather impacts, and this is kind of what's circulating and being shared among the internet. Same thing with climate engineering. There's a new theory about kind of the wildfires in California and how they've been caused. So what do you do with this? I'll note that the influencers, they have this from a marketing kind of website that looks at internet content, and they have an algorithm that says, okay, people are talking about this, but who influential? And this has actually shifted. Now C2G2, the organization that is trying to catalyze effective governance globally, actually is at top. And that wasn't the case 6 months ago. So maybe some progress there for groups that are really dedicated to having civil discussions about this. But the main thing is that the stakes of getting public engagement and conversations right are really high. What we saw last year from the hearings in Congress convened by Lamar Smith is that, this was being framed as a possible tool and you don't have to talk about climate change. On the other hand, people find that involving publics is really important in future research and governance. So it's kind of a criteria for this. So how do you involve diverse perspectives in a media ecology like the one we have? The final point, something I've been thinking about that I wanted to throw out there is that we're really familiar from basically all of our stories that we tell. You might have seen this kind of graph in English class in high school where stories start out with, an introduction, a rising action, different plot points that go up and down, but a climax and then a resolution. It's really like the graph of hoped for emissions in these 1.5, 2 degree scenarios. So I wonder to what degree some of this stuff is just us trying to fit the technologies we have into this narrative structure of our lives. And I thought I'd just close with some big picture social questions. There's certainly a lot of them. I picked 4 somewhat randomly because they're the ones I'm dealing with now. Is this curve just an artifact of our narrative structure that we're imagining to make ourselves feel better about this really terrifying moment that we're in? Is it possible to discuss these approaches in a media ecology where fake news is rampant? And if not, what then? What about all these sentiments that researchers like me have about inclusive public participation? More on the policy front, what can be done to link solar geoengineering with carbon removal, adaptation, and mitigation? How does the society accomplish what would essentially be a 200-year-long intervention and follow through with removing carbon if you start solar geoengineering? And finally, suppose some progress is made in scaling up CDR. How do you keep fossil fuel companies from changing the goalposts and allowing more and more residual emissions? So, thank you. I look forward to further discussion of these.
All right, great. Thank you both so much. So first, before we have I want to be sure we leave plenty of time for audience questions. But do either of you have any quick rejoinders or anything you wanted to offer in response to one another's presentations? Okay.
No, Holly's always right.
Okay, Holly's always right. Okay, we'll start with that as our premise. All right, so maybe what I want to do is just kind of reflect on the intersection between the two presentations and give you a big broad question. You can choose kind of which pieces you want to engage with. So Holly, you gave us kind of a large scale frame thinking about carbon budgets and then thinking about public perceptions of geoengineering generally and solar radiation management specifically. And then Will, you talked a lot about the Paris Agreement and you kind of hinted at these larger governance challenges, but I want to back up and just like frame the big question, which is, how are we going to govern decision making in this context? Because I think one of the things that emerges from both of these presentations is we don't have rules to govern CDR really or solar radiation management, but we don't even have normative principles that are guiding us at this point. And so that's the big question, and I think, Will, you have an optimistic vision of Paris as both being enabling of using CDR, but also as offering some possible tools for constraining use. And then, Holly, you have talked a lot about different perspectives on solar radiation management and how this might influence not only the possibilities in this context, but how we choose to govern solar radiation management. But in doing so, I think the emphasis really is on the global north. And so the challenge, of course, as we start to think about governance of both the research and the deployment of geoengineering, both CDR and solar radiation management, is what do we want to do, what's possible, but also who's we? Because right now, we, and kind of any geoengineering conference you go to, largely American or European, largely male, right? And so whose voices are being included in this conversation? And in particular, because geoengineering is likely to have impacts far beyond the place of its original use. So a big governance question, but maybe letting the two of you engage where you want to.
Where do you want to start, Holly?
Oh, do you want me to start? Okay.
Yeah.
Obviously, I don't think anybody has a great answer for this yet. And probably the answer that emerges is going to be imperfect. My main concern is that, a lot of the discussion about governance is on the level of states, but states don't often represent the interests of their citizens very well. So I conducted a series of interviews with people in Finnish Lapland up at the Arctic Circle, because there have been some ideas about, whether you could geoengineer the Arctic or not. And people, what I found is that, they feel like they're on the periphery, even though they are in the global north. They're still in kind of a remote region that doesn't get that much attention. They feel like things are happening elsewhere. And that's in kind of your best case democratically governed country, right? So it's kind of a wider question we're facing in society more generally. I think, the reason we have the leadership or non-leadership we have at the moment is precisely because people don't feel like they're being heard or that they matter. So in those conditions, I feel a little bit grim. I think that the governance will probably emerge in a crisis situation. It might be through these kind of meetings that the C2G2 folks are doing, where they have already these pre-existing high-level relationships. You asked about whose voices are being heard. I think my next slides were about, from my very early work, I haven't revisited this, but back in 2010, I found that 3% of the assertions about geoengineering made in the press were by women. So really it was a concept that men were giving voice to, explaining what it is, kind of what the framework is. You'd also find a lot of meetings that look like this, right? And maybe this has changed in the past few years. I think it might have. I think it's probably gotten a little bit better. But I feel like there's a kind of window when the first discussion about what we're talking about is set, and that was determined by men in the global north. And I'm curious how flexible it's going to be in the future. Maybe I'll just leave it there, and I'm very interested to hear what Will will say.
Yeah. Well, it's not very often I say this, but I'm somewhat optimistic about how this might transpire. There's always a possibility that these geoengineering options will be deployed unilaterally, and countries will say, screw everybody else. This is just what we think needs to be done, including the solar radiation management technologies. But there's plenty of precedent to believe that that won't happen that way. We have a lot of areas in which countries can unilaterally do things that would be destructive to the global commons and not look out for the interests of other countries, and it hasn't happened. We have treaties that are fairly well enforced in terms of dumping of materials in the world's oceans, ocean pollution. We have fisheries agreements, despite the fact that countries could unilaterally rape and pillage all fish in an area easily with one fleet. We have nuclear weapons agreements, and these are all premised on the proposition that it is not in a country's best long-term interest to act unilaterally. And that creates a normative framework that leads to international agreements. Okay? I think there's a possibility that that will happen in this context also. Even if you could unilaterally deploy solar radiation management, for example, and start putting sulfur in the atmosphere, you might set the temperature of what you thought was the optimal level if you were Russia and wanted to see temperatures increase some so that you could open up large swaths of agricultural area. You could weaponize solar radiation management that way. If you're Sri Lanka, you want it at a very different level. It's possible that countries could respond to others' efforts to set the thermostat at one level by setting it at another level, and it could be chaotic and catastrophic. That creates a favorable strata for international agreements, and that's what we've seen in other contexts, and I think there's some chance that that will happen here. The other reason I'm somewhat hopeful is we are starting to set the framework for at least how we would assess these technologies. I talked about Paris, and Paris has done nothing when it comes to geoengineering. It's not really on the radar screen of most of the countries that are parties to the Paris Agreement or the delegates that come to this treaty. But there's other treaties that have been looking at geoengineering already. We have a treaty called the London Dumping Convention, and it regulates putting materials into the oceans and their impacts. When we started ocean iron fertilization experiments, that treaty started mobilizing. It started setting some markers. It says that if there's research in this context, it should be done on a small scale. It shouldn't be for commercial gain. It should be transparent so that we can look at the results and assess it. And we should have a risk assessment framework. And they established a risk assessment framework, which is quite detailed, right, in terms of how those experiments are to be transpire. The Convention on Biological Diversity, which was also concerned about the impacts of ocean iron fertilization on biodiversity, has set some of their own standards, and they've also started cooperating with the London Dumping Convention in terms of establishing those standards. So I think there's a possibility that we will put some of these things in place and start regulating the research in ways that takes into account some of the concerns that I had, some of the concerns that Holly talked about, Doug, et cetera, and at the same time will ensure that it's not just old white guys in America that are looking at this issue and potentially regulating it, but also will include the global South in some of those regimes. So that's my hope, at least.
All right, so let me ask a follow-up question that's very specific to the room today, which is that how much of the development of what happens in this space do we want to leave to the scientists and engineers? Like, how much should the law and policymakers be involved? So this is an area where there's not a lot of law and policy, and so a lot of the research agenda, what's being studied, what's being experimented with, how that's happening is actually happening largely by the people who are working in this space, the engineers and the scientists. So, and many of the people working in that space, you know, David Keith, et cetera, think this is the way it needs to happen because if we use law and policy, it'll just slow it down, it'll get in the way. What are your thoughts on that?
It's always so hard because I can't look up at Holly and see if she wants to start. Holly, you want me to start or you start on that one?
Well, I mean, what I found earlier, and I think this is mainly still true, is that scientists were largely giving voice to it. And I mean, looking at who else is on the horizon right now, I'd rather the scientists kind of maintain leadership. That's just an off-the-cuff personal feeling. I think one challenge, I've been in a lot of discussions about what types of federal funding we might want for this. I think that there's been some level of philanthropic funding that's trying to make up for the lack of government engagement. And my hesitation with that is that what I like about public funding for research in this is that you have an open call for proposals, where it's a transparent process. There's a process for who gets that money, and it's really great for including different regions of the country. So if you take carbon removal, for example, I think we need a huge amount of funding directed to extension work and land grant universities in rural areas, because those are the people that are going to be living with these technologies, right? And it would really be nice to have solar geoengineering funding spread out the same way so that it's really emerging from a diversity of perspectives and regions. Maybe I'll leave my answer there.
I would disagree. I don't want the scientists leading this. There's an incredibly important role for science in this, obviously, in terms of helping us assess what the potential benefits of these are and what the risks are. And one of the risks we always have, of course, and we see it in a lot of contexts, is that that research is often routinely ignored by policymakers for various reasons, or misconstrued either intentionally or unintentionally by those that don't understand the science that are in the policy community. So there is that, right? But at the same time, I've seen in this context ways that scientists have talked about these issues that scare the hell out of me. Or I sometimes find naive when it comes to politics or law. For example, one of the scientists that's already been mentioned when it comes to potential negative impacts of geoengineering. For example, let's say it would imperil the monsoon in South Asia from time to time, and people would either die or there'd be huge amounts of damage. His response has been that we'll simply compensate them, right? We'll have a liability regime, right? That's a legal construct, right? When people are injured, we sometimes compensate them, right? But there's a couple of questions there. One of the problems you have in that context is lawyers. The minute you try to establish a liability regime, you will get a cadre of lawyers defending the country that's deployed the technology, arguing that the monsoon's strength is subject to huge natural variability, and you can't establish a causal link between the geoengineering and the impacts, right? So it's not so easy to just establish liability, okay? And that requires lawyers, and it requires law people to help us flesh those things out. The second question is it sounds fairly valueless to me. What does it mean? If your children die as a consequence of this, how much do I compensate you to make you whole? Is it $20? Or are your kids worth more? Are they 50, right? There's values behind it that I think that the policy community and even the legal community, even though it's a bit of an oxymoron to say values and lawyers, may bring to it that scientists may not. Sometimes I find the scientists' perspectives on these to be a bit too dispassionate. Same thing with risk assessment. In my opinion, risk assessment has to include, and Holly's talked a bit about this, the opinions of the public and how they perceive risk. The public often perceives risks differently than scientists do, for example. And are those to be devalued? Certain risks are magnified, certain kinds of risks are perceived by the general public in ways that are different than the scientific community. And if we were to have a democratic system, I would argue that those kinds of ways of viewing risk have to be incorporated into the assessment framework. Scientists often, and I work with some of them, seek to resist that, and I think that's disadvantageous. I think it will both delegitimatize a lot of this kind of research and imperil it, and it also strikes me as a bit elitist and anti-democratic. And so I think the policy community and the legal community, to some degree, can be a voice for those kind of things, as the social science community more broadly, and it has to have an important role.
All right, great. So let's move to the audience questions. And I see some of them coming in, but I think we need some more. So keep thinking about what you might want to ask, because you've got two great experts here. Okay, so I'm going to combine two of these questions. So one of the questions was, is it possible to reduce carbon dioxide emissions by an effective amount, even if the U.S. refuses to participate in reducing emissions? So if the U.S. opts out. And then I'm going to combine that with another question, that's the kind of international level, which is the second question is about the local level. So how much can states and cities do to mitigate carbon dioxide emissions in the absence of federal oversight? So we can think about it as how can cities and states, and we'll add the private sector, contribute to the U.S. actually being a part of this? And even if the U.S. isn't a part of this, can we do anything effectively to reduce carbon dioxide emissions?
Okay.
All right.
I guess I can start on the first one with the caveat that it's more of a broader climate question, right? And so caveat of limited expertise. What I would say is the United States, there's good news and bad news when it comes to the U.S. and our pulling out of the Paris Agreement, right? The good news in many ways is that we're not as important a player as we used to be from a standpoint of greenhouse gas emissions, right? Our global emissions, if you look at all global emissions, we're about 16% now. So if the rest of the world community is really acting in earnest, what we're doing or not doing may not have as much impact, okay? On the other hand, the bad news is that a lot of these countries legitimately perceive us as economic competitors, and so and a powerful economic competitor. And so if the U.S. chooses to opt out of these things and countries perceive that they're putting themselves at a commercial disadvantage by then continuing to aggressively reduce emissions, it may create a drag on what other countries are willing to do also, kind of a race to the bottom. And so we have impact. We're also extremely important from a standpoint of technological development of alternatives, right? Or at least we used to be. And if we withdraw and take our technological prowess with us, it's going to have some impacts in terms of what we would do. But to some degree, it is tied to the second question. I mean, the good news in some ways is that the U.S. has been reducing its emissions despite the fact that it hasn't been a player in most of the international fora for a long time, right? We're a member of the Framework Convention, but it was more of a kumbaya sort of framework. We weren't a member of Kyoto, which had some real commitments, and now we're not going to be a member of Paris. Despite that, we've been reducing our emissions fairly steadily over the course of the last couple of decades. Good news and bad news is we're doing that. Some of it's related to fracking, right? A lot of it's related to fracking. Not everybody may be comfortable with that. We may not be assessing the impacts of fugitive methane emissions in ways that are meaningful, and so we may not be seeing the kind of reductions we think we're seeing, but at least we seem to be moving that way, and we seem to be moving to renewables largely as a consequence of market-driven, not ideologically driven reasons, right? And we may be past a tipping point where no matter what we do at the national level, a lot of those things will continue. And so I think the rest of the world has a lot of things it can do with us at a smaller percentage, and a lot of these things are happening in the U.S. despite what pronouncements we may be getting at the top right now.
Holly, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, the second part of the question was about what cities and states can do in mitigation. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much written on this. I wouldn't be the expert, but I'd say that in almost every sector, there's something meaningful that's happening and that could be increased. So transportation, obviously cities can do a lot with that. States can too. I just bought an electric vehicle that was actually cheaper than a comparable old-fashioned car, just because they made it that way through their different incentive programs. Industry is maybe a little bit trickier, but buildings, huge opportunities there for codes. Natural and working lands and how they're used, California is really trying to take a lead there. Different states have different programs around soil carbon sequestration. And so there's a ton of things that can be done on the mitigation front at these scales. And that's kind of one source of hope for me personally.
So I'll just add, these are things I think about a lot as well in my work on international and domestic climate change law. And so for those of you who don't know, when President Trump made the statement about pulling out of the Paris Agreement, we did see an upwelling of response from both states like California that are already very progressive, but also other states and other non-state actors, private sector and NGOs. And there's a couple of ways in which that's manifested. The first is a platform called We're Still In, which includes a whole range of actors and is kind of sponsored, kind of initiated by Bloomberg. And it basically is a group of actors, states, private sector, universities, religious organizations that said that even though the US is pulling out, we're committed to making sure we meet the obligations we said we were going to meet. And it's like the private sector that's involved is like accounts for something like 25 trillion in capital, so a huge amount. And then states like California are really, really significant in what they do because their greenhouse gas emission profile and their economies are as big as many other nation states. And so there is a lot of capacity, which will then lead us to our next question, which I think is really just a follow-up, which is what can and should governments do to induce private corporations to develop and employ technologies for carbon capture and sequestration, and I'll add, and/or solar radiation management. So private sector, do we want them involved? Do we want them not involved? Do we want the government incentivizing them? Do we want to leave it to market forces? What are your thoughts? Nobody wants to talk about the private sector?
No. I think on the carbon capture side, at least, the private sector has an important role to play. A lot of the technological developments that are happening right now, companies such as Climeworks, which are working on direct air capture, the companies that have been developing carbon capture and sequestration, right, which can capture carbon from flue gas, right? So when you burn coal, for example, you can capture the CO2 and then store it. A lot of that is private sector driven. And so I think that kind of research is extremely important, and we should be incentivizing it. We're starting to do that. In the United States, we just strengthened a law that provides tax credits for capturing carbon, right? One of the problems that we have is a bit of a chicken or egg sort of thing with these, is that if carbon capture is to become economically viable, we need economies of scale and we need to learn by doing, right? But because it's so expensive and there's no price on carbon in most places, certainly not in the United States, we're not going to get to that scale, right? So one of the ways that we can try to scale up and thus bring costs down in the long term in terms of economies of scale and technological well pooling is to provide those kind of tax credits. And so that's one of the things that I think is positive that we're doing in the United States, and the Europeans do it to some degree. And we should continue to engage in those kind of activities. But the private sector definitely has a role because it's been in the cutting edge of developing some of these technologies. And if we're going to scale them up at a really large scale, a lot of it's going to be done in association with things like fossil fuel production, cement production, et cetera, those kind of facilities. And so the private sector clearly has to have an important role to play, and the government has a role to play in trying to help create economies of scale as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I would largely agree. I don't see that the private sector has any role in solar geoengineering. with the exception of maybe, I think Amazon should be donating computer time on its cloud servers. I think that, they have a role more generally in kind of informatics and monitoring and stuff. But I would agree with Will that there's an important role in innovation and R&D and the initial development of these technologies. I would just stress that I see them really both as state-led projects. The scale of carbon cleanup, it's like dealing with sewage or garbage or any other huge waste product that we've eventually learned to kind of deal with. And the only way you get that is by, making it not okay to throw garbage or sewage on the street anymore or dump it into the air. And that's the government has to do that part.
All right, our next question I think is, again, more of a general climate change law and policy question, and it's a litigation question. And so I'm going to give you the question as it is, and then I'm going to tweak it to try to make it also a little bit more about geoengineering. So the question is, recently a court ruling requiring the state to increase emission reductions was upheld in the Netherlands. So this is the Urgenda case? I don't know how you pronounce it. And in the US, the Supreme Court did not block the young people's suit against the government. So this was a case based on this idea that the federal government should hold the atmosphere in trust for its citizens. It's a constitutional argument, and it's a public trust argument. And then so the question is, do you expect these types of cases, so maybe we can think of it as creative litigation, to become more popular? Is this an effective way to address climate change mitigation? And so I'll just add to that. Do you see litigation as being a tool, an emerging tool in the geoengineering context, whether we're talking about carbon removal or solar radiation management, and if so, how? And well, maybe you should start.
Yeah, I guess. So litigation is interesting in terms of climate change, or at least interesting if you're a lawyer. I actually did a book on this in 2005 when there was a bunch of cases where you had states, for example, suing fossil fuel companies, arguing that, for example, hurricane damage was associated with greenhouse gas emissions, and that the fossil fuel companies should be liable for the hurricane damage that occurred, for example, in Louisiana associated with Katrina. And so you saw a proliferation of these suits, some against the government, some against corporations for the damages associated with climate change, and calling on the governments to reduce emissions or require corporations. Most of those did not go very far. And the primary reason is that judges are loath, at least in the United States. The Netherlands is different. Governments are loath to make decisions that they believe should be made by elected officials who are subject to the will of the people. And the argument is always that if, for example, we as a court were going to compel the government to reduce emissions by 20%, that's going to have a very large cost, right? And the American people are going to incur that cost. And if they want to incur that cost, the way they can decide that is through their elected officials. But if we as the court decide that, we've removed that democratic element to it, right? And so they argue that we shouldn't do that. The other thing courts have often said is, we don't want to tie the hands of the US president in his or her negotiations with other countries by imposing our own mandates when he or her may be negotiating with other countries, okay? And so they struck down those cases. So we're now in a second wave where we're seeing some of that litigation, as indicated. There's this case in the Netherlands. I think that was different in many ways. They had legislation and constitutional provisions that made it easier to prevail in that case than you would, for example, in the United States. The other case that was referred to, they said the Supreme Court didn't block this suit by young people. There's a group of young people in a case called Juliana that have sued, arguing that there's a public trust requirement to protect the environment, and that the government can be compelled to do that by compelling reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. But that's a little tricky. I saw the press ballyhooing the fact the Supreme Court didn't knock down the suit at the Supreme Court level, but it was something called a writ of mandamus, and what the court really meant was that the lower court, the appellate court, was really who should be considering that writ. And I'm going to guarantee you that if that case goes to the Supreme Court, they will vote against the young people. There's a number of those judges, including the two newest judges, that are on record opposing this doctrine. And so I don't think there's a substantial role for, at least in the United States, for litigation. But as I said, in some other countries where they either have constitutional provisions that provide for a right to a clean environment, for example, or other kinds of things of that nature, that kind of litigation can get some play, and it may reduce it. And courts in some of those places have less deference to the executive branch than they do in this country. But in this country, I think it's going to be difficult. So litigation in terms of geoengineering, I mean, if you have private corporations doing it, you may, on the other hand, see cases for injuries that are associated with it. And you'll have all the questions of causality and damages and stuff like that, but that could potentially happen in the future. But I think general climate litigation is a difficult sell in the United States. It's a difficult sell in other places. And in international regimes, we had a case years ago where the Inuit people in Alaska, Russia, and Canada brought an action to the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, arguing that the U.S. was violating their human rights because of their climate change policy, or lack thereof, right, as Inuit lands were being devastated by climate change. That was a form of litigation at the international level. They did a huge brief, I think it was like 400 or 500 pages, and they got a dismissal of their action in a sentence by the commission, right? And I think the commission really was afraid that it would look foolish if it were to decide against the United States, and the United States just said, we're not going to do anything, right? So it's a question of whether you as a body thinks that the decisions that you issue will be adhered to. If they don't, then it decreases your legitimacy, right? So there's a huge political component in all of this. And so I think litigation can help publicize these issues, and that's not a bad thing, right? Keeps it on the radar, keeps it in the public eye, and that may help to change norms in the longer term. But I think from a standpoint of the law, you're not likely to see much effectiveness, at least in the US.
All right, so we only have about 5 minutes left, and there's this great question that I'm going to play with a little bit to try to get you guys to offer some concluding thoughts. And so the question is, if someone wrote a play, and this is why I love it, if someone wrote a play about how humans will avert the climate crisis, we assume its storyline would involve a climax followed by a resolution. Might our reduction projections be less a bedtime story for comfort and more of a potentially successful political strategy that policymakers should attempt, by which I imagine you're thinking long term. But maybe we can also tweak it and say, might our reduction projects be less of a bedtime story for comfort and more a story of failure? And if so, what role does geoengineering play in that world where we really don't mitigate? Have fun.
And I'll let you start with that, Holly, since you had the storyline.
So was the question, in a world of climate failure, what role does geoengineering play?
I think that's my interpretation of it. I don't know if that was the person who asked it.
I mean, there's this kind of storyline about the Anthropocene writ large that it's like this moment of awakening where we realize kind of the tragedy that's unfolded, and now we have the knowledge to like see what's been written on the landscape and then adjust our actions accordingly. And so kind of the tragic element with climate change is that there's delay. There's a time effect delay between the emissions and seeing the impacts, right? So it kind of interrupts that storyline of, oh, we realize we're going to take responsibility. So I think that, you know, that play is definitely a tragedy. And the only thing kind of at the end is, well, you know, at least the protagonist realized it was just too late, but, you know, maybe they're going to make their peace by doing this small action. I think that the carbon removal is really the piece of it that is like the restitution, or, you know, that would make it have like a gentle ending, as if, you know, there's this big tragedy, there's this failure, there was solar geoengineering, but at the end, over, you know, 1,000 years, they finally made it kind of livable for other species via this huge removal project. And it's still a really sad story, because it didn't have to happen. You know, there's a ton of infrastructure. The main thing is like the way in which carbon removal is carried out. I think that's what it hinges on. Will's comment earlier about, you know, a little bit of optimism about solar geoengineering governance, I actually share that view, looking at how things are in 2018 with regards to solar geo governance. I think that the really hard part is going to be doing the carbon removal if we ever started the solar geoengineering.
All right, so any final thoughts that the two of you would like to share with our audience, and in particular with all of these students who could be going out and working in this field, thinking through these big ideas? Any final thoughts?
I would say just thanks for showing up and engaging. These are really hard topics. They really require grasping the scale of the emissions and kind of all the delay that's happened up until now. But, you know, I don't feel like we still have time to, you know, make things better. And like a 2-degree world is still way, way, way better than a 4-degree world. And we have that choice. So that's about it. Thank you very much.
Well,
yeah, I'd say two things. I mean, one, you know, contribute your expertise, think about what role it may be playing to address some of these issues, because there's an incredible amount of intellectual, you know, ability in our world's universities, and we're going to need all of it, or you're going to need all of it. And second of all, stay involved politically, because putting pressure on politicians to do the right thing is incredibly important. If they don't perceive the issue as one that you will vote for them on or against them, they don't care what you think about the issue, right? Those are the only issues that matter to most politicians, right? And so if these are issues that matter to you, you really have to make it clear to them that you vote and that you will vote for them or against them on the basis of those issues, so that they take attention to it. And that's the only way we're going to fight this as a nation.
all right, so please join me in thanking Dr. Buck and Dr. Burns for this talk.